Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute, and I'd like to welcome you to our webcast for this week. It's November 1st, 2018. We're just days away from the strategically important midterm elections in the United States, and I think we should start there. It's clear there's been a chaos operation that's building on top of the previous chaos, the chaos that was unleashed when Trump won the election with Russiagate. But in the last weeks, we've seen a massive escalation with fake pipe bombs, an attack on a synagogue, both of which were blamed on Trump, the caravan in Central America, which is being played up as a huge issue in the media. And obviously, there's an effort to succeed with a significant Democratic vote to knock Trump out, to create the basis for impeachment. So, Helga, why don't we start there? What's your sense of this chaos operation, and also what Trump is doing with his campaign and what we're doing?
Well, I think at this point it is really impossible to make a prognosis. At least I don't want to do it, because you have, as you said, you have a real orchestration of a chaos scenario. And I think it's very noteworthy that the very recognized military and security analyst, Pat Lang, on his website denounced these letter bombs to the Democratic so-called opponents of Trump as costume theater. With other words, that there were no real devices which would make them able to actually detonate, and that it's all orchestrated. Now, I think this is very likely because, it raises eyebrows. It just would be so fitting to blame this on Trump. Also, to the New York Times today, of all places, they felt compelled to have a huge attack, a defense of George Soros, who has been accused of financing this march of refugees coming from Central American countries. And they couldn't help themselves but to include an attack on my husband. And the New York Times generally for a very long time had a policy to never mention the L word, because, that's their nemesis. But they obviously are so freaked out that they mention my husband in this context. Now, I think this shows just how desperate they are, because, I think the potential of this election is really big. It's going to be a game changer either way. If the Democrats, who are completely hyped up on the woman vote and all kinds of hysterical orchestrations, if they win, and I'm not saying all Democrats are bad, I think there are exceptional people like Tulsi Gabbard, for example, but mostly the Democrats have really portrayed themselves as the war party in this. So if they would win, they obviously would want to go for impeachment of Trump, trying to win over some corrupt neocons from the Republican Party to do so. And they would like to shut down the investigations in the Congress about that really Russiagate has proven to be Britishgate and Muellergate. And this is a historic question, because the collusion of the heads of intelligence of the Obama administration with a foreign government, not with Russia, but with British, with the CGHQ and MI6, and the British government, which intervened openly, in the Foreign Office intervened openly. I mean, this is potentially the biggest scandal in the history of the United States, bigger than Watergate. And if Trump wins or has enough backing in the Congress and the Senate, you can be absolutely sure that these investigations will go on, the truth will come out, and then eventually the culprits will all be target of probably criminal prosecution and their just sentences. But eventually, I think it will also come out is, why was Russiagate launched? And I want to repeat that, because there are many people who are falling for the press lies, but the real issue is not, it's not domestic. It's not all the issues which the media try to make you believe. it is the large issue of war and peace. And whoever does not understand that, they're just completely off target. It is the issue of World War III, and we should talk about that in a little while. This is a very acute issue, and that is the issue of the Trump election. Trump has clearly said he wants to improve relations with Russia. He has proven that he wants to go in this direction in the Helsinki summit with Putin. And just before we started this program, I was happy to learn that Trump had a long telephone conversation with President Xi Jinping of China, and they basically expressed hope that the trade conflict can be settled. And even Kudlow said, that there are absolute possibilities to take back the tariffs or most of the tariffs if there is an agreement with China. So I think this is very good news. And don't forget, the real issue about Trump and the election in the midterm election is the relationship between the United States, Russia, and China. And who does not understand that just is an ignoramus in politics. And I want to say this very clearly, because obviously the issue of war and peace is the precondition for any other issue to be solved.
And Trump has been making this a campaign issue. He has 11 speaking engagements coming up in the next 6 days leading up to the midterms. And he's been saying explicitly, going back to his campaign in 2016, that he wants to improve relations with Russia and China. This is a post-election strategy with meetings coming up with Putin, with Xi Jinping, and with Kim Jong-un. But I think at the same time, as a result of Russiagate, the narrative of Russian interference in the election, the lies about Russia and China, we're seeing a real shift toward war. And I think this is very important to just reiterate, because the question is, why is it that we would be heading toward a war with Russia?
Well, I think that it is very clear that, first of all, I just had the occasion to travel for a few days to Moscow, and I attended a conference there on Russia-China relations, and I had also a whole bunch of very important institutional discussions. Now, it is very clear that the reason why Russia is being targeted is because, and why Putin is being targeted, because if you remember, when the Soviet Union disintegrated in 91, basically, all the promises which were given to Gorbachev basically were all broken. They had promised that there would never be the moving of NATO to the Russian borders. There would be no NATO beyond the East German states in the unified Germany. All of this has been broken. And what has happened basically instead is, you had the Yeltsin period, which in the conscience of the Russians has been a decade of genocide. In these 10 years, the demographic curve of Russia had collapsed by 1 million per year. You had a complete sellout. You had the oligarchs taking over the property of the Russian people, becoming rich, and basically privatizing anything. You had Jeffrey Sachs, who went with the shock therapy, and the intention of the neocons and the British and some other forces in the West was to reduce the status of the Soviet Union being a superpower to a Russia which would just be a raw material producing and exporting third world country. And they succeeded to a certain extent in doing that. For example, the shock therapy reduced the Russian industrial capacities from 91 to 94 to only 30%. You had absolute misery. People were poor, and it was a real genocide, as Sergei Glaziev wrote in a book with that title. So then eventually Putin came. He was appointed by Yeltsin, but Putin came and he started to undo all of these things. He managed to get back control over the oil and gas resources. And the West had already, or some people in the West had thought they had all of this in their pocket and they would eventually control all of the raw materials of the very large territory of Russia. And then Putin comes back and he reverses that. And obviously he had to make certain deals with these oligarchs, and this is still hampering the situation up to the present day to a certain extent. But he proved also Obama later on to be wrong, who had already bragged that Russia is just a regional power. But when Putin intervened in Syria in 2015 and basically completely reversed the situation there, he proved that he's a global player and that nobody can bypass Russia. And the military moves which Putin has done in response to the NATO changed doctrine, basically, and going in the direction of new weapon systems based on new physical principles, outmaneuvering the military of the United States and NATO to a certain extent. I mean, that caused a complete rage, and the demonization campaign of Putin started. So if not take into account, the shock therapy in the 90s, what the West did to Russia in the Yeltsin period, one cannot understand why the Russian population is so absolutely, I think more than 80% are backing Putin. I met several people who I asked what they thought of Putin, and they said he's the best president in the history of Russia ever, because the Russian people are completely thankful to him that he undid what happened in the Yeltsin period, and he's bringing Russia back. And despite the sanctions, which do hurt the Russian economy, despite of that, he is bringing Russia back and has brought Russia back. So I think that is something one should keep in mind, because the media like to always cut a certain date, like Putin fell from the heaven and all of a sudden he's demon, but it leaves out what happened before. And it is that fallacy of composition which is then being used to manipulate people to think that Putin is a devil. The Russian people think he is the best president of their history. And I think people in the West should think about that, that after all, what counts is what is the outcome of his government? Is he doing something for the common good of the people or not? So anyway, I just wanted to say that. And it was very helpful for me to have these discussions. I haven't been in Russia for many years, and to refresh a direct impression was extremely helpful. And I was actually quite taken aback that several people, quite independently from their particular angle, said there is a serious discussion in Russia that war is an absolute possibility. And just in the last couple of days, this was publicly confirmed by the representative for non-proliferation and arms control in the foreign ministry, Andrei Belousov, who spoke in front of the United Nations, saying, yes, I confirm Russia is preparing for war, but we are only doing it in response to the fact that the United States is preparing a war. So I think this is a very serious thing. And if you look at other remarks which were made in the recent period by General Ben Hodges, who is the former US commander in Europe, who in a meeting in Warsaw in Poland said that he thinks that the United States will be at war within 15 years. And you had Xi Jinping talking to his military officers, saying that they have to be ready for war. And then you have this largest NATO maneuver since the Cold War, Trident Juncture in Norway, with 50,000 soldiers, 10,000 soldiers from Germany alone, which is a very provocative maneuver, basically rehearsing how to replace or displace NATO troops in the case of a war with Russia very quickly. Russia has regarded that maneuver as a complete provocation, and they will launch some missile tests, I think the day after tomorrow, also in the north of Russia, close to this maneuver. So that shows you that, you know, we are really in a very, very heightened danger. And I think people should really understand that, you know, we must have a better relationship between the United States and Russia and the United States and China, because, you know, once these things get out of control, it could mean the end of civilization and the complete annihilation of the human race. So this is what we are talking about when we are talking about the midterm election, and I think people should take that to heart.
And just to take up the China question a little further, you mentioned Hodge's statement about being at war with China within 15 years. There's also Michael Ostlund from the Hoover Institute, a known figure who's hostile to China, writing in the Wall Street Journal, saying that China wants to displace the United States. But at the same time, you had the Trump Xi Jinping discussion, and there's a congressional delegation heading to China. And I'd like you to just give a report on this fairly significant conference going on in Shanghai, an export-import conference, which again is bringing leaders from countries from all over the world to China to discuss implementation of the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yes, I think this is very important. You know, China has said that they want to have an annual conference like that. It focuses mainly on import. The Chinese authorities have said that the import of goods, especially high-tech goods, will be beneficial to the Chinese economy. It will be a huge event. 160,000 buyers will be there. I think 5,000 firms, 12 heads of state who will have at the same time big state visits, you know, in this context. And, you know, it just is one more proof that China really wants to continue its opening up and, you know, is basically inviting cooperation. And I think in that light, it is very, very good news that Xi Jinping and Trump had this phone conversation.
And also on the war front, I think it's important to note there was a very significant intervention by Defense Secretary Mattis and also Secretary of State Pompeo regarding Yemen, where they issued a call for an end to the war. Helga, this has been part of an ongoing human rights catastrophe, and most of the world has been silent. But now there seems to be some motion in the US Congress. What do you make of this Mattis and Pompeo statement?
Well, obviously, it's long overdue because, you know, the humanitarian catastrophe, which is really a genocide in Yemen, it has reached a point of, you know, the danger that the whole Yemen population is being wiped out. I think there are 13 or 15 million people in acute danger of starvation. And, you know, now that the US government has basically said that they want all parties to have a ceasefire. They want the Houthi attacks on Saudi Arabia to stop. They demand the Saudi-led coalition should stop bombing populated areas in Yemen, and that a peaceful solution must be accomplished within 30 days. I think this is very, very good, and one can only hope that, you know, this is being carried through forcefully, because, you know, many people are in danger of you know, dying of starvation, lack of medicine, and, you know, this is the biggest scandal in the present time anyway, and it's finally good that this should happen.
Now, I think people would very much like to hear from you on what's happening in Germany after the elections last weekend in Hessen. There's a scramble now for who's going to replace Merkel as the chairman of the Christian Democratic Union Party, which had a significant loss again in Hessen. The Social Democrats are collapsing. And I don't think you can look at this without connecting it to the effects of the economic crisis hitting Germany. So, what can you tell us about Chancellor Merkel's future and, more importantly, where Germany has to go from here?
Well, unfortunately, this is not good news because it's taken with a big sigh of relief that Merkel announced her resignation as a party chief of the CDU coming the CDU convention in December. She says she wants to stay on for the rest of her term as a chancellor. So that is good, and many people say this is high time that this woman would, which meant a complete standstill and many wrong decisions like the energy exit, like the really bad policy towards Africa. But the not so great news is that so far none of the people who have announced themselves to to replace her are any better, or some of them are even worse. There's Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, the minister president of Saarland, who is basically said to be on the same line like Merkel, and she was actually appointed more or less by Merkel as a general secretary of the CDU. So that would probably be not such a big change. She has a lot of support in the CDU, especially among the women and the apparatus. But then there is Jens Spahn, who is a terrible neocon. He's presently the health minister, and he is really a neocon. So he met with Bolton when he was in Washington. He has a lot of support by the Anglo-Americans. But then there is Friedrich Merz. Now that's a very special case because he is an arch opponent of Merkel. He was kicked out by her, I think, beginning of the 2000s as a faction leader, and she replaced him in this function. He went out of politics, and he has been basically in many functions since. He's presently the head of the German part of BlackRock. Now, people now basically say BlackRock is not a locust, but there are doubts about that. Then, he's the head of the Atlantic Bridge, which is a complete, transatlantic neocon institution. He's also sitting on the board of the German part of HSBC, a bank which, interestingly enough, is being investigated because of involvement in the very scandalous Cum-Ex Cum-Cum scandal. We can briefly mention what that is if people don't know. And he's also a German member of the Trilateral Commission and many other such posts. So now, if you look at what Merz has advertised in the past, he said 123 euros a month are enough for the Hartz IV recipients. BlackRock has advertised the privatization of pensions altogether. And naturally, Merz himself has come out for a positive response to Macron, his proposal to have more integration of Europe, which would not function under these present centrifugal tendencies in the EU at all. But anyway, I cannot see anything positive coming from Merz, from Spahn, from Kramp-Karrenbauer, or Ritzenhoff, who is a fourth candidate mentioned, who's a complete anti-China hysterical person. So this means Germany is not in good. And naturally, if you had early elections, it could, really lead to terrible developments. The Greens gaining, who already are gaining, then the AfD could gain. So Germany is in trouble. I want to say this very clearly because, the present policy of the German government is not to cooperate with China like the EU. Their Africa policy is still the same old sustainable and more focus on small and farm cooperatives, no infrastructure. There was just a big conference compact with Africa in Berlin, which was terrible. So I don't think that the German situation is something to be happy about at all. And it just will mean that, the Schiller Institute will have to amplify, we will have to amplify our efforts to bring some reason into the German situation. And I would like all of you join me and join us in this effort, because if Germany goes all the wrong way, it will not be good for the rest of Europe nor the world.
And what Helga is talking about is join the Schiller Institute, become a member, and go to our website where you can sign up for that. And Helga, one other point on Germany, it does appear that the people who are involved with Africa in Germany, in the Mittelstand and elsewhere, are beginning to get a sense of the importance of working with China. We see this from the Africa Verein. Do you think this has a potential counterweight to what we otherwise see as the European Union's opposition to China's involvement in Africa?
Well, I think it's very good that the Afrika Verein spoke out. They had a big article in Handelsblatt the day before this conference took place, and they demanded the creation of an investment fund to help German industries to invest. Now, the point which was made by the leaders of this organization was to say, what it's obvious that Africa will be more than 2 billion people by the year 2050. Many of them will be young people who need jobs. And therefore, it is an urgent necessity that Africa is being integrated into the world economy if there is not supposed to be a catastrophe of new refugee people coming in great numbers. So I think, it takes really some more organizing, because we talked to some other responsibles, and they said that as of now, the German government is not really going in the right direction. I would like to bring up one other point, however, which I think is extremely important. Now, before Xi Jinping and Trump meet on the 30th of November on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Argentina, before there will be an extremely important summit, and that is on the 11th of November. That's just 10 days from now. Putin and Trump will meet in Paris at the occasion of the anniversary of the 100th anniversary of World War I. And I think this is a very important point, because coming back to this war danger, what we were talking about before, if people really understand what happened in the First World War, which we have documented at great lengths, was really the result of a British geopolitical manipulation, which lasted practically for over 20 years, where after the ouster of Bismarck, all kinds of things were manipulated: the Triple Entente, the Entente Cordiale, the Russo-Japanese War, 1805, the Balkan Wars, all to prevent Germany from going into the, what was an early form of the Eurasian land bridge, namely the Trans-Siberian Railroad, the Berlin-Baghdad railway. This was orchestrated to prevent such a continental Eurasian cooperation. Now, when the World War happened, it was 4 years of horrifying slaughter of people. Soldiers were in the trenches for 4 years, slaughtering each other without meaning, without sense. The result of it was that the entire generation of Germans were so traumatized by the war that they were completely derooted. They were the basis then for the Nazis to recruit. And this is what led to World War II, naturally, together with the terrible conditions of the Versailles Treaty. So we had 2 world wars, which obviously people who have any inkling of history must have a noble commitment that this should never ever happen again. And I'm very sure that Trump and Putin will use that occasion to make that point emphatically, very strongly. And hopefully, they will introduce some other paradigms, because if we do not get out of this present geopolitical confrontation, humanity is absolutely at risk. So I think, in a certain sense, I know people in the United States have very little sense of war. I have been told many times, yeah, the United States, we never fought a war on our soil. But I think, the fact that you have now, as a result of still the Vietnam War, but especially the Iraq War, the Afghanistan rotations, many soldiers who were deployed in these wars, which were mostly based on lies, they came home after two terms, or even three terms, going back on rotation, totally traumatized. And you have 22 suicides a day in the United States. That means 8,000 people a year committing suicide, and this affects about 3 million American families. So I think that, in a sort of terrible irony of history, it is these foreign wars which, is residing in a situation where people know that Trump is right when he says, let's not have these interventionist wars anymore. So I think this is a very important occasion, and I'm very hopeful and almost certain that Trump and Putin will use the occasion of this First World War commemoration to make a dramatic proposal to change policy. And I think this is what people should have in mind on November 6th.
And just to add to that, Helga, I think the point you've made very beautifully is that the issue is war and peace, and it's not that issue is not going to be decided on November 6th, but it will be decided looking into the future and with the activation of our populations. And again, join the Schiller Institute, become a part of our fight, and let's make this world a better place. And this is where we start. So, Helga, anything else you want to add?
No, I think, this is an extremely crucial moment in history. So don't sit on the fences, don't watch it passively. Become active with us. Become active with us as a Renaissance movement, because the world needs urgently a new paradigm. And join our Schiller birthday celebrations wherever you are in a country where we're having them. So contact us for that also, because the ideas of Friedrich Schiller are extremely important. They are the most noble image of man. And that's why the Schiller Institute is called Schiller Institute, because we want to have an impact of the beautiful ideas of Friedrich Schiller on the world and history.
Okay, and we'll see you next week, Helga.
I hope so.